Hello, everyone. We are back for session two of Roll 2 DMs. I am your host, Josue Mellicrit, and I'm joined by Solomon,
Solomon,
now with the
yes.
correct,
By popular demand, we added my Discord user.
now with the correct username there. I'm
Yeah.
glad to see it. How are you doing today,
I'm
Solomon?
doing fine. I'm happy that we got lighting.
Yeah, it looks a little brighter.
Yeah, I remember like looking back at the VOD, and we just turned into grayscale, and it was wild. And then it was like, yeah, it was very funny.
Yeah, we'll still have to do some tweaking with the coloring,
Yeah, we
but
still need. Yeah,
hopefully it's a little brighter,
it's
a
a
little
lot brighter. Yeah, I'm
better
looking at the
looking.
stream right now.
But thank you all for joining us. So session two today.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about probably kind of like a pretty well requested topic.
Yeah. No, it's a
Um,
fairly. It's a common thing that most teams face.
Heck yes. So once again, a reminder that the topics that we cover on the podcast are definitely want them to be community driven. So send
Yes.
us your questions. We'll also be looking at the chat, so feel free to ask them there, and if we can get to them, we definitely will. But yeah, let us know what you guys want to hear about. But I guess we'll start off
Yeah.
with our topic today.
I guess before we start, I just wanted to thank y'all for like showing up last stream. I was really surprised by like it was pretty cool seeing everyone show up and like interact and stuff. I couldn't really check the chat while the stream was going, but like looking back, I was like, damn, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Felt great. So we appreciate the turnout. And yeah, keep coming through, and hopefully we can all just hop in on the discussion.
yeah,
So yeah, to kick off the discussion, our topic for today, and I guess technically our first question,
yep,
module or homebrew, and more specifically, I guess we'll talk about. We're not talking about which one's better or anything.
yeah. To each their own.
We'll be
Yeah.
definitely chatting about the differences of module versus homebrew. As a, I guess, a point of, openness, we will mention that, Solomon and I haven't run tons of modules, but a little bit of history on, I guess, modules for those of you who aren't super familiar. We'll mention just a couple of them. But modules were kind of like the OG way that people
It
started
was
playing
how
Dungeons
people
and
ran.
Dragons.
Yeah, people around the game. They
Um,
use modules. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if we take a look back at that graphic, if we can, one of the very first modules that was actually released by the company that would later become Wizards of the Coast was released in 1978.
Which is
So,
a while ago.
so roughly, I think 2 years after the game, after the first edition
You would be
was
the best
published.
judge of that.
I don't exactly remember. I think 1976. That sounds right in my head. But yeah, Steading of the Hill Giant Chief, and it was like a really short, really compact little adventure. It was probably, I don't know, 2 to 3 sessions from what I
Yeah.
could see, relatively short.
Fairly compact, and like it was really just like I feel like back in the day modules were really just meant to like show us how we ran, like games in general, like how to run a game, like it gave you the building blocks, the tools, like back because like before D&D became like the popular thing that is right now, no one really knew like how do I become a DM, like modules were like kind of the handbook or like the example like problem set that you have like in a like textbook, like just shows you how it's run.
Yeah, and especially with the actual publishers of the game,
Yeah.
supporting things like this, it was really like some of the more popular ways to get into the game. And then, a little bit later, a little bit more modern kind of complete adventures like we see on the graphic Die Vecna Die, which was a lot longer. That was like a 5-chapter module that had, I think it took place across 3 different settings. So it's like a lot more complete, a lot more of what you see from like current
Expansive,
modules,
yeah.
where you have the BBG, but you also have like a lot of
Secondary
fleshed out
bosses, yeah.
NPCs, secondary bosses,
People
towns.
with motives that are not aligned with the party sometimes, or could be like directly in support of the party.
Yep.
It depends. Yeah.
And then more modern examples like we saw there, obviously Curse of Strahd, one of
Yep.
the most popular modern 5e modules.
Yes.
Extremely iconic villain.
Yeah.
Extremely
Strahd, everyone knows
iconic
Strahd is-
setting of Ravenloft. And it actually happens to be, I almost called it a rework, but it's like a revamp, like a refresh of
restructuring
a way
yeah.
older module.
Yeah. No, Ravenloft. Yeah.
A second, I believe a second edition module called, exactly, Ravenloft, which
yeah.
is where we first were introduced to Strahd in that whole Ravenloft setting. So there are tons of modules out there. I personally I've only run one, and I've only played in a chunk of one.
Yeah.
I've played in a session of one, Descent into Avernus.
Yeah.
Highly underrated if you guys haven't checked that one out.
Yeah. No.
But yeah, so Yeah, again, full disclosure, we don't have tons of
I have
experiences.
zero experience running modules. I'll be
Um,
honest. I played in a module,
that's what I
but
was
even
gonna
that one
say.
went off the rails like after the third or fourth session. uh, but the thing is, that's the thing. You know, modules are like a guide.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to follow it as much as you can just like if the players want to do something else and you are comfortable doing it, jump off the rails. You know, like we play like for me. Like the module I was playing in was like Waterdeep Dragon Heist, and we started out fairly like vanilla and like just going across the like first chapter of it, and we got to about I can't remember exactly. I'm not really sure exactly which point we hopped off the rails, but I think it was after we stopped investigating the obvious plot points, and kind of like no one was really interested in it, and we just like. I remember like our DM Kobe, like he was very like he tried and succeeded in making something that was, although set in Waterdeep technically, was definitely not Dragon Heist.
Yeah. So, as a player, what are some of like the stark differences? Because I think this is something that I think people might be interested in. But as a player who's played both modules and has played in a bunch of homebrew, what is like as a player the biggest difference? Like the thing that stands out the most when you're playing?
Honestly, I feel like in general, with like as a player playing in a module versus homebrew, you might not be able to tell which one's which. It's, if you're like starting out in the game and you have like zero experience on like what are the popular modules and like you haven't read through any of the books, you can't really tell. Like a good DM is really capable of like being able to like mix that stuff and just run a game. So I would say like one of the biggest things is most modules by Wizards of the Coast are set in the Forgotten Realms like setting. Like like the world setting is a fairly easy landmark and like obvious thing. The use of certain factions that are like kind of synonymous with like Wizards of the Coast and with the Forgotten Realm setting. Right. I feel like is a big thing.
Yeah, for sure. So as a DM, funny enough, the only module that I've ever ran was also Waterdeep. And when I started DMing, I actually didn't know about modules like at all. My first time playing was as just like a rando player in a rando party, and then I ran my own campaign with.
Yeah, Homebrew. I remember we discussed that last session. Yeah,
exactly.
It was interesting finding out about how you ran games with D12s instead of D20s.
Oh my goodness!
Encounters.
Just for just for random encounters. It was a little bit of spice. But yeah. So my first time was Waterdeep Dragon Heist, and I remember actually being more lost and confused than actually like assisted. And I think
really
I think there was like a point. I think I ran like one or two sessions very by the book because I didn't really understand how to use the module as like a tool versus like just playing the module.
Oh, yeah.
It almost felt like I was like a player reading through
like
it.
Restricted by the module itself.
Exactly. So I wanted to make sure my notes were like way too extensive for my first two sessions. I was also playing with a lot of players that were like brand new that I didn't know at all.
Yeah.
So that definitely had a factor. But I like overnoted so much stuff. I had like
you almost memorized the whole like book.
Exactly. I took really, really stringent notes because I thought like the best way to run the module was to run it how it was written. And that was definitely my mentality for like the first one or two sessions. And then I think it started wrapping around, when they started introducing things like factions.
Oh, yeah.
And things like
the Zentarum and Xanathar's faction.
Exactly. Where there was a lot of intrigue that I wanted to do different things with. And so it went from something where I was just like completely over prepared to like, oh, there's a lot of cool things that I can pull from here, but I can do whatever I want. So like I started, reflavoring NPCs to like what I had in my head. I started reframing some of the setting. Obviously Waterdeep is nice and it gives you like a very, very good map. Which is honestly really helpful for city campaigns. Sometimes designing urban campaigns is kind of hard.
Like a good city map is hard to pull off at times, especially for new DMs. Like if you have no tools at your that you can use, it's kind of tough like making something that feels lived in and as detailed as you can find like Waterdeep. Because like there's so much moving parts that don't even matter to the main story.
Definitely.
Just exist to like further like make the world like real to an extent.
Exactly.
Immerse your players,
And I think that was probably one of the most valuable things of running with a module is that it creates a setting that already, like you said, it already feels lived in. It feels like you're putting players in a setting that's like already well structured and if the players weren't there, Waterdeep still exists. I think that's like an interesting like way to think about it. So, yeah, the campaign, it stayed fairly on the rails, I would say, other than the fact that my party decided that they wanted to become crime lords.
Oh.
And so they got really into, and obviously like you're running the adventure, and that is not.
Oh yeah.
That's
definitely.
not how it runs.
Yeah.
But it has the capability to do that.
Yeah.
And so when it kind of started dipping that way and sliding that way,
Yeah.
I felt like I had so much agency. I was like, okay, let me start making factions. Let me start making more NPCs and
Fleshing
more.
out some of the elements that are already there.
Exactly.
You know?
And I think one of
Yeah.
my favorite things that I did, and I think where I really discovered how to use it as like a tool, was there were a couple points where Dragon Heist like branches off. You know?
Oh yeah.
And there's like different options. It's kind of like I wouldn't call it downtime. It's like middle time where you're not like straight up in the adventure. And I took some of the tasks, right? Like, cause some people are part of factions, and I turned them
like errands and stuff like that.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I just like turned ones that became I wouldn't call it pseudo evil, but like pseudo criminal. So like there was one where they were supposed to help this guy move a transport across. And so I utilized like new NPCs that I'd come up with in like a relatively like new part of the city that I started fleshing out.
Oh, okay.
And I turned it into basically like a small heist. So as opposed to them like moving, whatever barrels of ale, they were moving barrels of like contraband. Yeah. Exactly.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a way of doing it. Yeah.
So that's like one really interesting and I think a very strong advantage to people who maybe aren't ready to dive into the homebrew. So funny enough, we haven't played that many modules, and we've talked a lot about modules, but let's talk a little bit about Homebrew and how it compares, because obviously there's some very big advantages to the modules, but I think there's also a lot of tangible benefits to just running your own Homebrew.
Oh no, definitely. Running Homebrew gives you like an amount of flexibility and just like agency for like as a DM that you can't like. Sure, you can have the same thing with like a module, and you can like run a game to the way like to your liking, but having like a homebrew setting allows you to use elements that won't really fit or like click with like module adventures, like having a world like that you designed and you made your own like gods for and a pantheon for, and have like factions that serve a more specialized purpose for your own story. I feel like is a thing that is really useful for lots of DMs. Just having that toolbox that you make, like it's kind of like machining your own tools to an extent.
That's a good way to put it.
Like instead of just buying a pre-made tool set, you have everything custom made. Ergonomic grip, nice tip. Like all that stuff.
Everything fits nice. Yes. Yeah, and I know you and I have discussed this a bit, but I definitely overwrite lore.
Oh yes.
Not because I need to, but obviously
creation
like
myths and all that stuff.
Exactly. So
I remember.
Yeah. I enjoy writing a lot. Like it's like an interesting way to get that outlet out, because I'm never gonna write a book.
It's a nice hobby.
I don't have like the English caliber to write something like a book, but that's like kind of something fun that I can do at D&D is I can write a lot of these creation myths and like background stories, old wars, things like that. I can make them as wacky as I want.
Yeah.
But to the point of what you're saying, it's essentially like machining my own tool. Like I am using my lore as like a tool for later on. So I don't need to like know about all these war generals from war that happened eons ago, right?
You don't have to fully play out an entire like large scale world war and like do the math and run all the like do like 10 D100 checks to see how each side fared and all that stuff, but it's fun sometimes to do that,
Yeah, well it's like cool because I can start involving it whenever I want, like when I have it there I can just involve it whenever you want. So like I think one way that I used it like a really old obscure thing that I just like wrote like in the back of my notes at some point about some like old war, they entered a dungeon and I was like, I kind of want there to be a fresco on the wall.
Oh,
what is this fresco of? And so it was stuff like that. And sometimes people bite, sometimes it's just like whatever, some detail, and they're like, oh, whatever. But some people are like, I wonder if like the war is like, exactly. That's where like you start like getting people to dig for checks.
Yeah, dude, and getting players to dig into like lore and stuff is like always just a very satisfying thing for me personally. Yes. Like having them bite and actually talk about stuff that they discovered is like just, oh my god, it's chef's kiss.
It's a feels good, man. But yeah, I definitely overwrite. So to the point of like the advantages of homebrew, I like having that flexibility to do a background writing because
Yeah.
um and obviously it isn't like the best way to feel about it, but with a lot of campaigns, especially ones modules that are set in like, the Forgotten Realms, like what is considered like, I guess, canon to D&D. I feel kind of weird um trying to like rewrite it feels
Oh
like you're
yeah,
rewriting
yeah.
history, and I
You're
might
intruding
run
on your
into
yeah,
a player that knows the lore really well and
and it's
be like,
confused.
hey,
Yeah,
but like that person died, whatever, like they actually know something that I definitely don't because
yeah.
I don't read Forgotten Realms
And
lore.
sometimes you get like that like actually moment where like, oh, actually Vecna used the Netherese scrolls for this thing, so technically it wouldn't even exist in the strongholds.
Yes.
And like stuff like that kind of intrudes on your own like pacing and story.
Right.
And like sure, it's always nice to have players who are like knowledgeable about the world and like are interested in it, but having it be in a pre-designed setting comes with a bunch of like kind of not really kind of baggage to an extent of just like having players have preconceptions and how like certain like factions or races or people in general are treated in a certain world,
Right.
like how like standard Forgotten Realms has like a bunch of like monstrous races who like might be perceived as being different than in your own homebrew world.
Yeah.
Which is like to each person's own taste and like to the party's like liking, really.
Yeah. And I guess that's another I think one of the biggest advantages,
Yeah.
and I guess this goes back to lore, but it's like the amount of flavor text that you can work in is so extensive. Like,
Yes.
in my world,
Definitely.
I like my elves to look very different from like the classical Rivendell,
Oh yeah,
Lord of the
yeah, yeah,
Rings
yeah. A lot
elf.
more angular.
Yeah,
and,
exactly. I like the idea of like the very angular, thin cheeked, big ears, kind of like more
Not human,
bony head,
yeah.
like less human,
And
yeah,
more
less
special
less
things. I
strictly
fully agree
human
with
with
that. Yeah.
bigger ears.
Yes.
Because I think again that's just in the way that I like to visualize it.
Yes.
I
No,
think
definitely.
it adds a little bit
Like
more.
the more Fey ancestry and like
Exactly.
more not of the material plane kind of effects is always very interesting and pretty cool, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. And so, yeah, it's a lot of like flavor text stuff,
Yeah.
a lot of little things that are just like really satisfying to bring into your own, because it is your own. It feels a lot more like your own than when you're running a module.
Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah.
And obviously, you can run the module so that you can change it enough and edit it enough to where you can make it feel your own, and you really
Yeah,
should. That
no,
should still be
definitely, yeah.
the goal of modules. But it can be a challenge sometimes especially if you're someone that likes running it by the books.
Oh no, definitely, yeah. And the thing is also, like running a module, it gives you a lot more like free time to write about other stuff. Like I can remember who I was talking to about like switching from module to homebrew. I think it was Michael actually. Shout out to Michael if you're watching. But yeah, like the whole way of using modules as kind of like a stepping stone and expanding with homebrew of your own, into the module and like kind of injecting that to an extent is a very interesting like tool that you can use. Like converting module to homebrew is a very cool thing. That,
Yeah.
and it's a very
Yeah.
like nice jumping point for
That,
like a new DM.
that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's another major advantage is you can learn a lot from modules because obviously like modules are written by people who love
paid for
D&D,
this,
like
yeah.
get paid to do it,
They're
are
professionals.
writers as
Yeah.
professionals,
Exactly.
but they also like they're D&D players and
Yes.
D&D DMs. Like if you look at obviously usually like if we're looking at strictly Wizards of the Coast D&D modules,
like Chris Perkins.
yeah, like all the people that work on those, they care about D&D. And
Definitely. Yeah.
if you look on the Trove,
Oh yes.
that's like people that like really really like it. There's so many resources, right?
Yes.
For
There's
modules.
definitely so. And even like from previous editions and stuff, it's always like a nice thing to like similar to how they did in like with Ravenloft to like Strahd. Like repurposing older editions for 5e is like a very like interesting and nice thing to do. Really.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of DMs too that
Yeah.
like taking specific elements, whether they be we talked a little bit about taking rulings from previous
Yes.
editions,
Yes.
but also characters and character archetypes and
No, definitely. Yeah.
like campaign flow styles. There's a lot of
Definitely,
things that
yeah.
you can learn from a well written module. So even if you don't run it, and I think everyone should take the chance to run a module because it is really it is really fun and it takes a lot of the pressure off your back to like have something super
Oh no,
fleshed out.
definitely, yeah. There's
You
a lot of
can
stress on you because you can like
yeah, you can do a lot of different things with it, and you're under less pressure to flush out everything.
definitely, yeah,
I guess that's like a good segue
yeah.
into our second topic question. We've kind of talked about it a little bit, um, but something to consider, and this is something that we actually got asked, was how
Oh
do you
yeah,
prepare for a module? Note take, prepare as a DM for a module
versus a homebrew.
versus preparing for a homebrew.
Yeah.
And that's again that kind of differs from person to person how
Yes,
people
obviously.
run
Each
modules.
DM, like has their own style and like way of like prepping and stuff.
Right. So I guess speaking relatively,
Yeah.
I kind of mentioned it before, but when I was running the module, I definitely did way less prep.
Yes, because you have everything pre-written for you.
Hmm.
You have the flavor text, you have the excellent descriptions, you have all that kind of like world like lore that you don't even have to like think about. You just pull it out. Like if someone asks you about something, most likely in the module they usually have a DC and even have like a specific check to get this info.
Yeah.
Or like they have the options set out for you, so there's no like kind of you can turn off your brain for a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say, yeah, particularly with modules, and we didn't mention this originally, but the fact that they write usually decently well balanced
Yes.
combat for you
Yes, that's
is
another thing. Combat, yeah.
huge. It's so huge.
Yes.
Because again, those are people that are professionally doing this. That shit has been play tested.
It's
You
been
know
play
it's been
tested,
play tested.
smoothed, streamlined, all that stuff.
Exactly. So it feels great not having to, because I know like when I'm preparing for homebrew,
Oh yeah.
not only
yeah.
do you have to pick your monster, you have to stat your monster sometimes if you're not
Damage
pulling
output
something
and
out of a
CR,
book.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. How much damage does it do? CR changing its roles if like you want to use a monster for flavor text, but it's not quite leveled up to the right
Reskinning
point.
monsters also is
Exactly.
a key thing I do.
Stealing stat
Yeah.
blocks and then just reskinning them.
Yes.
Yep, exactly.
Like converting like a vampire spawn into like a Viking vampire spawn.
Yeah, to a degree, it is a fair amount of work.
Yes.
Whereas, like in a module, you look at it, and not only is the module sort of already like flavor texting monsters for you that are usually gonna fit with the campaign setting or with the campaign situation, but yeah, just having those things statted out so helpful. I think that's the
really
biggest
is.
time
Yeah.
saver running
I
modules.
agree. Yeah. No, like having everything like the math has really been done for you. You don't have to worry about like TPKing because you made one specific ability like a
Because your
bit too
twig
busted.
blights are too strong
Yes,
against
dude,
the level
yeah.
1 party.
Exactly, like action economy. I'm telling you, that's the thing that people forget about when like running stuff. Like CR wise, it may seem fine, but having every single twig blight do one attack on one person throughout like the full like round of combat, it messes you up.
I will say, as a caveat though, be careful if you're running a module and
yeah.
you're not running it for 4 to 5 players.
Oh yes,
Because or whatever the module
the
is.
average party usually is 4 to 5.
Exactly.
Sometimes they have like adjustable sliders on like how to like if your party is this size, perhaps add a bunch more monsters, or if your party is below the size, then add more or less.
And
switching them out. Also.
Matt did mention in the chat here, which is a good point. 5e Tools has pre-annotated adventures and
Yes.
models with notes, which is also
Yeah.
super helpful.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the biggest time sinks when I'm prepping homebrews is definitely combat.
Definitely.
So, and I personally don't like combat. We'll probably get into this on a different day.
Yeah, combat is a whole different beast.
But I don't love combat just in general.
Fair enough, yeah.
I only really run it because it adds some like gravity to the situation.
Like thematic and story.
Exactly.
Fair enough,
But
that's
it's a huge time saver, and honestly, a lot of the times, and this is what's cool about modules too, is like you can kind of pick and choose a module based on how much you want of one thing.
Yeah.
Something like
an entry,
like Avernus is gonna have a lot of combat because
lots
that's
of
like
demons also.
that's a very deadly module.
Yeah.
Same thing with like Strahd's Dungeon of the Mad Mage is
yes.
literally
It's
a dungeon crawl.
Yeah.
So it's all combat.
No, definitely in puzzle like dungeon crawls and puzzle solving is like a thing that like previous editions were a lot more focused on. Nowadays, I guess like it's slightly shifted towards more narrative focused stuff.
Right.
I would say.
Whereas like you could probably pacifist run Waterdeep.
Yeah,
you could probably pacifist run Dragon Heist.
Yeah, if you knock out the like Kenkus on the first thing, you can probably talk your way through a bunch of stuff with a flexible DM. Really.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm for that. Yeah.
Because Yeah, that's
I'm all
like a
for
cool
pacifist
amount of
runs,
variability.
honestly. Yeah.
But I will say that is also a big advantage of homebrew.
Yes.
With homebrew, you can pick your pacing and you can adaptively change it, right? So like if you're like running a campaign and you haven't had combat in a while and you feel you need to stick in combat, you can just kind of do that. Not to
Yeah.
say that you can in modules, but that kind of shifts the advantage of module in that with your homebrew campaign, you have complete control over that. Like you don't need to dramatically change what a module is already doing
Yeah,
to
definitely.
fit
Yeah.
the pacing of your campaign. So if you feel that there needs to be an epic fight like right now, or
Do it. Yeah.
the opposite, right? You don't want to fight for a hot minute, you can just kind of like push it off and push your players in
Or
kind of
just cut
different
them out.
directions.
Also, like
Yeah,
lots of times, like you can just eliminate that combat encounter and it's gonna work fine. Have a
exactly.
puzzle instead, or have a social encounter instead, and it's not gonna be like that much of an issue. It's really, if that's what you want to do it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and because again, when I first ran D&D, I thought that like
You had to run combat. You
I
had to.
thought
Yeah.
that like surprise encounters were mandatory. Where like if someone's
Nah.
sleeping on your watch,
I never do
you're
that.
gonna punish them, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like now, like I literally only thematically combat.
Yeah.
Like it's only if unless the players are like really hunting for it.
Exactly.
Which again kind of comes down to party and player composition. And that just kind of depends on again what you guys like to
Sometimes
play.
you just like give the party a long rest. There's no need to roll any d12s. Yeah.
But the D12s bring danger, bro. Danger levels.
Yeah, no, like but it's no. I'm fully for that. Like I usually like, I try my best in my games to give options to players and how to encounter like issues and problems and stuff. But like sometimes combat is the most logical conclusion if the party's for that. I'm not gonna stop them. If y'all want to fight these people instead of like solving a puzzle or doing a fetch quest, understandable. Like go for it. But like yeah, it's having that prepped and having that ready is also a very key thing.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful. And I think yeah, just in general, the density of notes is less. Though I will say sometimes, again, it depends. If you really, it can be the opposite. If you really want to change a module, your note taking might have to be way more extensive. So like if there's like a point in the module where you've deviated so much from the module,
Yeah.
fuck it, dude, just change it. But it's gonna take a lot more time.
By the way, that's why you just messaged me.
I know. I was hoping
Yeah.
that
Oh.
Ibrahim might
Oh,
be
yeah.
able to see it on his end. Disregard that because I don't know if we can change it. But yeah, I think whenever you want to deviate significantly,
Yeah.
from the module, that's when I think the note taking and preparation becomes a little bit more tedious.
Definitely, yeah.
Because
You're gonna have to account for stuff that since you're running something homebrew, there's no real like set marker on, like there's no boundaries.
right.
You just run it, and like it depends obviously on the game you're running. But for me personally, I don't really like putting boundaries or like set invisible barriers. I usually prefer to make them physical. Like having like some kind of group like besiege a place that's where you can't leave, or you're trapped in the city due to like a plague or quarantine
Right.
and stuff. Which might be a bit too relevant to now, but yeah, I was thinking of doing that when like the whole COVID thing started initially, but I was like, we've been through that IRL. We don't need to go through it.
No pandemics in your
Yeah.
homebrews.
No, yeah, not for a while.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think with homebrew specifically, it's kind of like weird sometimes, coming up with like the encounters and then having to change them last minute. So when I do a lot of like prep work for homebrew in particular, I try to stick kind of to it, and I think that's because I think the first like really good campaign that I ended up running that I felt good as a DM and I felt like my players enjoyed was actually that Waterdeep module.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And I think it impacted a lot of how I prepare for homebrew now.
Fair enough.
I think a lot of my homebrew, and I think because I've showed some of like my writing to Matt, I've
Yeah.
showed some of my writing to you.
I've been
and
there for a lot of that writing.
I write it.
Yeah.
I write it kind of like how I read. I like the way that it was structured in the module.
Yeah.
So like I'll write chapters. It might also be that I like kind of writing it like a book. But like I'll structure it in chapters. I'll put little blocks for NPCs, little bits for lore. It's very like it's definitely overwritten. Everything about my note preparation is probably just super overwritten.
I'm very much the opposite, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it was impacted by how that module was sort of written. So I took a lot of inspiration to the organization, the chapter organization.
Like
the movement of an arc too, because it was helpful like organizationally in my head. Exactly, it helped me pace it. Because when I finished the chapter, I'm like, okay, like this is like I had these goals in mind, and again, the players can do whatever they want. I can, and that's like a risk to overriding is that like when you've
they can totally avoid your plot point,
right?
You know? Yeah.
It hurts less when you're running a module and they go off the rails.
Yeah, because you spend like 3 hours at like 4 a.m.
Then if you homebrewed for like 3 hours, like writing some elaborate
or like
plot or whatever,
stab blocking this like big boss like final thing, and like okay they're gonna fight this in like 4 sessions, and then you kind of like you get to like 3 sessions away and they decide to go pacifist. I'm like, yeah, fine, I'm for that. You know, this stab block I status is gonna be on your side now. Congrats. You know.
So yeah, the way that I like writing my homebrew is very. And we've talked about this before, where it's like I like doing it very linear. Like I like telling a very particular story when I'm writing. But again, I'm not like setting up walls, and I think that's something really valuable as a DM because I think it helps you play better as a DM and being adaptable as a DM. But I think also players probably in general enjoy more, you know, not having
like
a lot
freer world.
Exactly, invisible walls.
Although having some restrictions does benefit, or not restrictions as much as obvious guidelines. Can be sometimes essential depending on the exact party, because some players just prefer having like an obvious goal to go to.
Yeah,
like a lot, like some people enjoy an open world, like nice play around, go around the city and like do mini quests and do like side errands and stuff. Others prefer to go to the meat straight in, no side dishes.
Yeah, and I think that goes back also to like the type of player, right? Like we've talked about like some players that like sitting back. And some players that really like being active, like at the forefront, being really active.
Yes.
And so I think it serves that to some degree, because when you're kind of writing around your story, you kind of know that the people that are at the forefront of the activity in your party are probably going to kind of direct it. Yeah. Exactly. So I think that adds a lot of value because you can talk to them, and like having dialogue with your players is so valuable.
Oh yes, even out of game and in game.
Exactly.
Like, I remember for me, I had to like out of game, I had to be very clear because I prefer not to be like too heavy-handed in game, just and can I keep it vague and keep it mainly to my benefit so I don't have to write as much, but also it's kind of to the degree of keeping the world kind of like more like realistic, and like there's not going to be an obvious like quest marker there. You're not going to have your compass tell you where to go.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Like having the player, like just having an out-of-game conversation of like, hey, guys, there's these couple plot lines that I have prepped. If y'all, which one would y'all like to go in first with? Which ones are y'all interested in? Would y'all be cool going, like, do y'all want to go into the sewers and fight, like, rat folk? Or do y'all want to go and, like, go to, like, the Capitol building and, go through this, like, bureaucracy and politics arc, Yeah. It's totally, like, because like for me personally, I have no issue running any of those like options. It's just that do the players want to play that? Like if just knowing what they're comfortable doing and what they're interested in doing is an essential tool in running a nice game.
Yeah, definitely.
Sure, it sacrifices some mystery and some like kind of like the master planning DM thing, but it's not really a big thing.
Yeah. No, and if you're playing with your players, right? Exactly. You're playing to satisfy yourself and your players when you're playing. Yeah, what I've done is largely like after session. I know because I also like to do character arcs, which kind of gets into a whole other issue.
That's it.
I guess not even really. So another way, this is I think a decent time to mention that when I'm prepping notes for sessions, sometimes it's kind of easier, because I like to write like arcs for characters.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
And so it's really a lot simpler in that sense because after a session, I can just go up to the player that I'm kind of focused on,
like what do you think
the couple of players that are driving the session, and I'll just talk to them and I'll be like, hey, what's like interesting right now? Like where do you think this is pulling? Where are you kind of looking to?
Asking the players what they think is a really vital and kind of like slept on tool lots of times.
Because it's like a twofold advantage to that. Obviously, the dialogue, and they can just straight up tell me, and I encourage people to tell me when I'm writing a game, like, I agree, hey, is this running okay? Is the pacing okay? Do you want more of this, less of this, whatever? But also, they can just straight up tell me, like, I think the party goes here next. I think this is where we go. And I know that for one, the rest of the party that's more tagging along, following, isn't going to be super offended because they're already kind of in that position of tag along. Yeah. But also secondary is when I'm prepping my notes, it makes it so much easier because I can write around the person who's in the spotlight or the couple of people who are in the spotlight. Not to say that I don't write character arcs for the players that are more laid back. that sometimes they tend to be a little bit shorter or not even full arcs, but more like moments.
Yeah,
Where
and it's
like
not like an issue. Like some
yeah.
people prefer to be, listeners and like like not super active players,
Hmm.
and that's totally valid and like like it's not bad.
Yeah.
Whatever, whatever you enjoy.
I think one of my
Yeah.
favorite ways to do that was to like just kind of thematically keep jutting in like the characters, like the quieter players' backstories or the quieter players'
Like
characters.
kind of like flash glimpses of put them in the
Exactly.
spotlight for a bit or two.
Like, cause they
Yeah.
go to somewhere
Whatever
like
they're comfortable
relatively
with. Yeah.
mundane, like an inn. Like
Yeah.
my favorite example was or like the I think one of the my favorite ways that I started getting a new player a little bit more like involved was their backstory was they were secretly like a master chef.
Oh yeah.
Like they were a wizard,
Interesting.
but they became a wizard because they wanted to like become
Be the best
culinary
chef.
masters.
Like transmutation or something.
It was a whole thing. It was great.
Nice.
But so whenever they would go to like an inn or something, or I
They'd
would
have their
write an
moments.
NPC.
Yeah.
I would like, I'd be like, you walk in, you see the chef in the back, and like I would make a point to mention that, right?
Because they'd be looking for that, in
Right,
character.
exactly. Or whenever they had any sort of downtime, or they found like a temporary HQ. You know how you give players save points sometimes,
Yeah.
or like a home base.
Like
I
a
would
place
make
like,
sure that the home base had everything that they
a
needed.
well-equipped kitchen.
Exactly. Or like at least a space for them to start
Yeah.
developing. So yeah, kind of went off track there, but yeah, it helps a lot in preparation for homebrew to have players that are driving it.
Yes.
Because with modules, when you're note taking for modules, a lot of the times you don't have like again, not saying it isn't an option, but it's less common for you to be following the characters
Because you
like
have
the
the tracks laid
PCs.
out,
Exactly, and more so following the story.
Yeah.
So when it's like you still want to have an open dialogue with players, but
sure, yeah.
it's less about that and more about like whether your adaptation of the module a lot of the times is actually
Is like
satisfying
suitable
the
for everyone.
players.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a fairly decent approach. I pretty much like I don't really hold that strong opinion on like running modules just because I haven't really personally run them, but I do agree like from just a theoretical standpoint that is probably like the way of doing it. I agree with that.
Yeah. They're pretty fun. I would definitely recommend for those who haven't gotten to do a module. I mean, they're just super fun. A lot of times they're like a really lean, generic adventure, and a lot of times you can actually note take less just because the players derail it so hard.
Yeah.
I think that comes with
Sometimes
like
less is more. Yeah.
adapting as a DM because you can underwrite for a module and just go like be a very adaptable DM. Obviously, there's a lot of different playing styles. So if you want to wing it and just have like a couple notes and run a game, that's great for homebrew. You can do the same thing in a module, but if you're trying to follow a module and then suddenly stuff starts like exploding, it's like super obvious. So like you're trying to like sort of follow the module and everything is so off the rails that it just turns, like you said earlier, it turns into homebrew. So it could backfire. I'm not gonna lie.
Sometimes it depends. Yeah.
But I don't know. They're really interesting. If
Yes.
anything, at the very least, you can take a lot of story points from
No, definitely. Yeah.
from
Like
modules.
for me, I do like using source books more. Like just in general for like world building, I really enjoy taking elements and like inspired by certain like I personally for me I'm a big fan of like the Eberron world setting in general, and I really like pulling elements and kind of like thematic components from it, then kind of like work it into my game.
Yeah.
Like having airships, having like stuff like that, like magic fueled by like elementals and like like the different the flavor and the general flavor of the source book, and like because sometimes like you can just pick one or two stat blocks from that thing or pick one like concept or like item or thing, and it just works. It fits into your world.
Oh yeah. And there's no denying obviously that Forgotten Realms is incredibly interesting.
Yes.
And has a lot to offer.
Definitely, yeah.
I mean, it's been around since the beginning, right? That is the original.
It's a very
setting.
lived-in world that has lots of like
the most like probably the most like in terms of like well-known and outreach writing, like that is what a lot of people recognize as D&D. So yeah, source books, great point. You could almost use modules like a source book.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Especially for learning things like story, because I think it's important to recognize too. As a DM, you can always like continue to improve.
Yes,
like,
obviously.
You can always be better. And that doesn't necessarily mean like you want to be like a certain DM that's like really good. I think it's like recognizing that when a session doesn't go well, because every DM has like a rough session, a rough couple
sometimes
sessions.
like something doesn't fall in place and you're kind of like left scrambling
Mm-hmm.
for a bit and it kind of throws you off your game. It happens sometimes.
Yeah. And so I think it's important to, number one, recognize when you're having a rough session or when you just had a rough session.
Yeah.
But number two, also realize that there's a lot of different resources to just improve. And I think modules are one really cool way to do that. I know people that have used modules when they're burnt out of like homebrew and like something didn't go super great for a campaign.
Take a break, take a breather, you know, like maintain running a game, but like, get a bit like, take a break.
Yeah. And so kind of going back to the original question, but this is going to be the case with pretty much every question we have. It depends, but a lot of the times it's less demanding from a note-taking perspective to run a module. But it also depends on the DM. Some DMs don't take any notes and they're insane and just go in.
Yeah, like I
reserve that. I reserve that for like one shots where I don't prep at all. Like I don't even like give thought to what might happen. But that's more as like an improv exercise than like as like straight up. I don't think I've ever run a session where I didn't at least sit down and like review what happened last session. And then like start looking at what might happen later. I've definitely underprepared, but that is like the extent to which I won't note take.
I write my session notes every 5 sessions, honestly.
Jesus.
Like most times when I'm like, I'll be honest, I do most of my writing in game. I think it happened a bunch of times, like running like one-on-one sessions or stuff, where like I just like run the session, and during the thing, like the players going around and experiencing and talking to NPCs, and while they're talking, I'm like, this makes sense for this person to say. This is now established lore. That like that's like these two people have an interesting chemistry like between them that I didn't really thought of initially, but like when they're talking to each other, what if they were like previous like party members from like an old party, or like what if they the samurai from this place, from this faction, and like the priest from another faction, and the towns guards, like the head of the towns guard, they're all in like one group a long time ago, and they have this like like underlaying like dynamic. Like that's all that stuff is like I do that most times like in session, just because that's when I'm most inspired. Like by my own players to an extent.
I will say, and I've kind of noticed this. You are a very involved DM during your session, and what I mean by that is like there's a lot of opportunities where you jump in and do a lot of interaction with players. Whereas I've noticed like when I kind of compare the way you've run to the way that I run, I've note taken a lot. But I do a lot of sitting back during my sessions of just like I'll feed them a little something and hope that they bite. And then ideally, and again, it depends on the dynamic of your party, I love when it sounds bad, but I love when I can be a little bit lazy and just watch it unfold.
Oh, no, definitely. No, that's a very satisfying thing. I'm fully for that. Like having like players talk to each other and discuss stuff and plan stuff in character, or like, reveal their backstory points that have been like maturing over like sessions, and having that all kind of like blossom into like, a very nice encounter. I really take great pleasure in having, like spending an hour with just like nodding and saying, yeah, you can roll, like just really just doing DCs. Like, just like the players do everything else. I just, be like, yeah, you roll a history check, roll an arcana check, roll a nature check, and that's really it. Yeah. And maybe chime in with an NPC at times when it's necessary, just as a joke.
So see, that's what I was going to mention is I prep so that I can almost be a player during my own sessions.
Fair enough, yeah.
Because I really like playing NPCs. I think playing NPCs are one of my favorite parts. And it's also something that I think keeps me engaged as a DM.
Yes.
Because, there is like the DM burnout where you see like you're doing a lot of work and it seems like only your players are having fun and all you're doing is crunching numbers and making DCs.
Fair enough, yeah.
So when I prep, I love having just like tons of like NPCs, and again, this also ties back to the fact that I love having really social heavy games.
Yes.
But I also like jumping. I like feeling I like immersing the players by also being immersed.
Having fun with them.
I think and again, that's just for me. It takes a lot of preparation for me to be like, all right, I can leave this. This is all set and stacked and done, so I can come back to it if I need to reference it. Now I can play D&D.
Fair enough, yeah. Like that's a very valid standpoint, and like I feel like that's more common for me personally during the later sessions of the game I'm running, because now like most of the lore has been established. Sure. Most of the players, like almost all the players, are informed on the key elements that I wanted to inform them about, and now they're just playing in the improv that I set up like 5 sessions ago.
Right.
Or like like that's why like usually I do my session writing like like every 5 or 4 sessions, because in reality like all the stuff that I really ran is like logical and just in my head it just fits.
Do you backwrite sessions?
How by yeah.
Do you like write out like what happened?
I write recaps, yeah.
Okay.
Like I
Cool.
really just do like previously on, like the game.
Okay.
And like just like the gang went and did this. I like referring to my party as the gang.
The gang.
Yeah, but like yeah. Like
Okay,
just,
I was curious because like
yeah, no, I definitely I post
again
write. Yeah.
part of my overwriting is like over post writing.
Oh.
So I like again because everything's like kind of like a book or a module.
Yeah.
I like writing like this happened like. It can be pretty extensive, and not even necessarily because I'm gonna reference back to it. It just like keeps it fresh in
Honestly,
my memory.
Most times, the only stuff I post write or stuff that I would know I would forget, like numbers. I'm like, oh yeah, this like this luck blade has 2 wishes on it, which is I guess a spoiler to any of my players, but like just that stuff is stuff I know I'm gonna forget for sure. Or like, oh yeah, the players are in like about 480 platinum debt.
Right.
Like that stuff is like just numbers and stuff just for my own honesty and for like the player's benefit. I prefer to write those down just because, yeah, I know during the heat of like in the game itself, I'm probably gonna like blank out because I'm focusing on running a character and music and stuff. Having those like session notes just so I know, oh yeah, this player has like 3 hours left on their crafting project. This player has already talked to this person before and has established a relationship with them. Like kind of that. Most of the stuff I write as post writing is like how NPCs perceive the world that the players are in. Like kind of from the world viewing the players to an extent.
Right.
And I usually keep the personal player stuff like to the own players to keep track of. Really.
Definitely.
Like if you want to do the personal project, go for it. But be sure to keep in mind what you're doing and keep track of that on your own also, just to encourage like player note taking also.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Like if a player is gonna raise gray renders, I'm gonna be like, yeah, okay, so you have 5 gray renders, you fed them this stuff. Could you please keep track of that stuff and how much you're feeding them and stuff? And I'll run everything else. I just want you to take note of the exact numbers and the allocations.
Shout out to the DMs that keep track of ammunition for their players. Y'all are psychotic.
Never.
Psychotic.
I've ruled previously that like unless the ammunition's special and it's super cool, if y'all are like have like 500 gold each person, getting a couple silver to buy a couple crossbow bolts is not really that like big of a deal. And usually I get unless it's like silvered weapon, because silvered weaponry is usually a bit more expensive. That stuff is usually like I keep track of that stuff. And like like this player has like about a 10 stack of this like crossbow bolts, or this person has like kind of like stuff like that in general. I don't really keep track of as much as I just have a mental note.
Yeah.
Really.
My biggest one thing that is completely the same between homebrew and module writing or preparation that stays exactly the same, never changes. Most definitely music prep.
Oh,
for
yes,
me.
Yes. No, I spent I think more hours.
0 time.
Yeah, I spent like 6 hours. Like when I first started the game, I literally my Spotify folder for like the campaign I run has like I think at least 10 folders in it nested, and like each person for their one shots had like specific soundtracks that I made. I would say like making playlists and making like the thematic like ambient noise and ambient music stuff. I say, funny enough, I put more effort into that than writing the game. Sadly, like I would say maybe like stat blocking, like heavy, like like stat heavy NPCs and like monsters do take I think usually I do like 4 hours total on each person most times, and like sporadically and spread out.
Right.
But like I would say playlist prep is a lot more. Yeah, I enjoy it also because I really feel like music has a very good like way of, especially playing something that's fully online and just like just purely like audio based. Having the music sets a really nice tone to stuff that would be lost through like Discord.
And yeah, I agree. I definitely prep for music a lot.
Yes.
And sometimes it helps me write. Sometimes
definitely.
I do it retroactively. I know we talked about like how Cowboy Bebop did this.
Oh yeah.
But I've definitely heard songs before, like
oh, this fits
throughout
so well.
my campaign before I start note taking for a session or something. I'll hear a song and I'm like, dude, this song would be so
The
sick
vibe,
with this
yeah.
specific setting,
Yeah,
or
I
like this
agree.
specific occurrence in the setting. That happens to me a lot to where like back right. But
Yeah.
it's also like a fun exercise to do with a module,
Oh,
because I
definitely, yeah.
remember trying to pick music for modules. It was
It,
also kind
yeah,
of a challenge
for
because
sure, yeah.
you can make it what, like, you can make Waterdeep and like super grimdark. If
Yeah,
you
no,
really wanted
definitely.
to, you could make that shit vile. You can
You
make
can
it
just play like Darkest Dungeon,
unbearable.
combat music,
Exactly.
ambient stuff like that,
You
and be
can
like,
make it
oh
super
yes,
dark.
yes,
You can
yes.
make it seem like the plague is just constantly set.
Yeah,
Or you could do something way more like
like a
jumpy, like
noir or
almost
like
Journey
yeah. Oh
soundtrack, where
yeah,
it's like almost like a quirky, like kind of beaten
more
downtown,
vibrant.
but
Yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah.
more vibrant, like
No, I fully
internally
agree. Yeah,
vibrant.
or like even like a very. I remember for me personally, like there's like a specific couple of songs that like they have a certain like beat and like style to them. I think it was like Haylong. They had like a couple of like songs that like I was like this song. I want to do something thematic. This frantic, like more vocal and kind of like tribal, like kind of a lot more old style. Like music. What if like what type of combat can I make that would fit this thematically? And like having these like almost frantic and rabid like vampire spawn that are kind of like Norse and kind of like Viking inspired, and like berserkers and stuff like that. That's like having like having music that fits that type of style, like making the combat for the music is a thing I've done a lot of times. And sometimes even like I really like listening to certain playlists while I'm writing. Like if I'm writing a certain like character arc that is like heavily like kind of usurp, like taking over something, or like takeovers and very like kind of like rebellious kind of stuff. uh I would say like it's a lot more uh it's just it just works really, like just having that music, like yeah.
Yeah, but death metal when planning BBG. Yeah,
Dude,
facts.
that's gonna
Big
make your
facts.
that's gonna make your stuff deadly. Like straight up, you're gonna be like, oh, this music. No, I have to put at least 2 death saves on at least one person, or else I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, dude. I don't know. My favorite villains are definitely like, um. Oh, I don't want to compare it to Strahd, because Strahd is like a very specific archetype.
Yes.
But I love playing soft, like piano jazz.
Oh, dude, the
With
refined
sax.
villain.
Yes.
Yeah, I always love that
Refined,
archetype.
refined. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
He knows he can kill you in a single, like in a couple of rounds.
But
if
he won't,
really
because
puts
that's
himself.
unprofessional.
Yeah, and
that kind of shit.
He's not in the mood, he had his nice breakfast. He had like a croissant jam and like maybe some like human liver with it, and like
Yeah.
like he's just vibing. He's not gonna ruin. He's not gonna mess his clothes for you. He's not gonna. He has this very nicely.
You're not gonna get
done
blood on
suit.
his silk, dude.
Yeah, no, literally,
Come
no,
on.
like yeah, he has these nice gloves on that he just got. He's not gonna mess them up. Like
Yeah.
yeah.
So
No, I love that vibe.
Picking
for sure.
picking villains off of music and
Yes.
vice versa, that shit hits hard.
Like just instrumental piano for that shit. Like just
Oh
it
my God,
works.
yeah,
It just it's
The,
very
the,
thematic.
the
Yeah.
instrumentals of the piano instrumentals of the Cuphead soundtrack,
Yes.
absolutely busted.
Oh, dude.
Absolutely busted
Yes,
for
yes,
villains.
yes.
Inkwell Island number 3. All right. So we are running a little bit. We actually talked quite a bit on that
Yes.
second one. I did want to bring up this third question, because we actually got this submitted, and I
Oh,
think
yes.
it's a really interesting
It's a very
one.
interesting question. That
So I'm gonna read it out all the way. So this will be like kind of our last question, and we'll kind of touch on this before we wrap up. So we have players versus DM homebrew.
yeah. Yes.
My current DM pretty much turns down most player homebrew, but most of their game is homebrew. And some players who are playing wizards and artificers seem to be able to get homebrew creations in on a semi-regular basis. It
Mm.
seems unfair. How do I make my own homebrew more likely or palpable to my DM?
Yeah. No, that's a definite like that is a topic that me personally I kind of like I it's one of the things where like you gotta understand certain boundaries between like player agency versus like DM's freedom to run their own world, is especially when the game is run in a homebrew setting. The DMs obviously homebrew everything because it's like,
Right.
it's in the name, but like and they have to like and they have a certain, most times the DM has a certain like aesthetic and kind of thematic and design approach to the stuff they're homebrewing.
Yeah.
Like if you want to make something that's high fantasy, high magic, like high technology, you're gonna want to have stuff that feels that way and you kind of like aligns with that aesthetic to an extent.
Yeah.
Like that's design style, and having having guns be like impactful and stuff, and having the damage dice be up on that stuff to make a gun feel like a gun. is a thing that, you know, some people like you downplay it or you upplay it, for example, to whatever vibe you want, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
So I do want to make one very important distinction because I thought about this after I received the question. I thought about this. There's one very important thing to consider that's like kind of separated. So I'm not sure which exactly they were talking about. But there's a very big difference between homebrew world building
Yes.
and homebrew mechanics and homebrew,
Oh, definitely.
which
Homebrew
involves
classes and
everything like
items.
classes. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Those things are a lot more volatile. I'm guessing because of like the mention. I'm assuming it's either like classes or abilities or things like that.
Things you want for you as a player.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I will just mention outright, and this is kind of like a shitty answer to a shitty situation, but
Yeah.
ultimately the DM, because they're the ones that are running the game, they ultimately reserve the right to reject
Yeah, no, definitely.
homebrew. I personally don't love implementing player homebrew unanimously because I again, not to discredit like players who make their own homebrew. I think it's really cool and a lot of
Yes.
times it works. A lot of the times it's also super busted.
Yes. Oh yeah, no, like having that, like the edge death lord, like, you know, like sword of 1,000 cuts, darkness made purely from the tears of 1,000 orphans. Like,
Yes.
all this stuff, you know,
Yes.
like having that do like 10d10 damage on a single like attack, and you're playing a fighter with like multi attack, like, you know, like action surge attack and that stuff. You're gonna take down almost every single enemy that I throw at you,
Right.
unless I make it impossible to kill and just a damage sponge.
Oh yeah.
That's stuff that I'm not really gonna run or allow, because I know it's gonna affect the pacing. And, you know, like I guess they did mention the wizards and artificers, you know, like, because I would say that those in general are like more like classes that have mechanics in place to innovate and to create that sometimes other class, unless you're like, depends on the DM really,
Right.
but like they inherently have that vibe of, you know, creativity and ingenuity that kind of works. And like DM has no, like, it's easier for the DM to fit in a homebrew when you have a wizard who's, you know, in character is known for writing their own spells and making that stuff from a theoretical standpoint. Same thing with an artificer. They're known for, you know, like the magic of the artifice, as well as, you know, like creating, and, you know, like they have the ability to make magic items by a long rest with no like gold requirements. You know, having that capabilities makes it thematically easier to fit homebrew through that way. Like having an artificer work on a project that is homebrew, you know, like obviously there's a case where you have to, like, DM to player cooperation is a key thing also.
Yeah. So
You know,
I was gonna
confidence,
mention,
yeah.
and that's probably like, I think probably the biggest takeaway that we've mentioned throughout like this session
Yeah,
is definitely like talk to your DM, because
definitely. Yeah.
at least for me, I prefer when players like give me issues to resolve as opposed to me thinking there's nothing wrong with my game.
Yeah.
Because none of our games are perfect. There's always stuff that we can improve, and as
Definitely,
DMs,
yeah.
I feel like we should always
It's a
strive to
learning
do
experience,
better
yeah.
games
No.
for players.
You're always evolving your style, you know.
So yeah, my first suggestion, and I think this would be the more straightforward one, would be to talk to your DM.
Yes.
Just straight up mention like, hey, like I've tried a couple of things. I've noticed that some other people have gotten their homebrew implemented. I'd like to, you know, either work with you to come up with a way to implement these things. You know, something like that. Open up a line of dialogue.
Yeah.
My secondary choice, and this is something that I personally do for a lot of my games because I'm pretty worried about breaking the game by introducing stuff that's really unbalanced.
Oh yeah. No, that's a worry. Yeah.
I flavor text edit things that are already in the game.
Yes.
So if there's like a level 5 spell, for example, level 5 spell
Yeah.
that does some type of damage and has some effect,
You can
I will
alter
take
it.
that exact
Yeah.
same spell and I'll just like change the wording a little,
Yes.
and I'll either like change the damage type or like change what it looks like, or slightly change,
You
you know,
work on existing mechanics.
something from a cone to an AoE, like
Yeah.
small changes. And again, it really depends on the purpose of your homebrew.
Yeah.
If you're trying
I
to
agree,
introduce
yeah.
a new mechanic, that one's a little bit harder to push, and
Yes.
it's very understandable for a DM to feel wary, because it's not necessarily that it's broken or that there's anything wrong with it. It's just, I know for me personally, I will definitely get nervous that somehow the introduction of that thing or that mechanic is going to break a lot of
No,
things.
I fully agree. Like, I think the way that I usually phrase it is when I homebrew and create stuff, I'm usually using pre-existing mechanics that have existed in D&D in general for, like, you know, a while. You know, like I take mechanics like, you know, I take the vampire like attack or bite and the DCs there, and I modify them to an extent, but I still maintain the same rules and settings that have been play tested and experienced and have been written by people who are paid to write that stuff.
Right.
You know,
That's
I
one.
trust them in
That's
that
one
regard.
important point.
Yes.
Is like a lot of homebrews, unless you're using a different system, which again, totally fine.
Yeah.
But unless you're using a different system, and
It's not
for a
gonna be
lot of
play
people,
tested, yeah.
for this podcast, we're targeting a lot of 5e.
Yes.
If you're playing in 5e and you're trying to homebrew something that doesn't fit with pre-existing features of 5e,
Yeah.
it's not the easiest thing as a DM to just say yes.
There's going to be growing pains. There's going to be compromises and adjustments.
Because
sure.
as you mentioned, people who made these items, people who made these mechanics, not only do they have obviously a lot of experience doing it, like a lot of the people that write numbers and ACs and features of
They've
items,
done that stuff for years.
they've done that stuff for years, and they haven't just done it for 5e. They've done it for board games, probably. You know, they've done it for card games.
For previous editions also.
Exactly. They have a
Definitely.
lot of experience.
Game design in general is a thing that you study.
Right, and that's why
Yeah.
there's like that one Twitter that's like famous for like rule. I don't
Sage
know.
advice.
Yeah, where it's
Well,
like very weird
It's a
rulings.
compendium on like kind of topical, problems and issues that
Right.
aren't super clear. Where they usually you just message the creator on Twitter, like Chris Perkins or like you just message them and they usually chime in and like say, because they wrote the thing, so they would know best, you know.
Right.
Like does like Accent Surge and like an Eldritch Knight, like their casting abilities, can they cast 2 spells on a turn with Accent Surge or stuff, or can they do a bonus action cantrip? Like all that stuff is like like these stuff are like the people who wrote the game would know best.
Yeah.
But obviously you have the right to ignore that. As a DM, you can just flat out just like delete that, or just completely just not do it.
Yep.
You can just throw out death saves if you want. You can just have them insta kill.
And we do toss that out to the player.
Yes.
But I'd say the same thing for DMs also.
No, definitely, yeah.
Be wary of the fact that you may create something that in your head is very, very balanced and is going to break your own game.
Definitely.
It happens all over the place.
Hot fixes are a thing for a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why I never show stat blocks until after I run the combats. Because sometimes I do some hot fixes and like take down, this thing should not have that 50 extra health. I should probably take this health down. And sometimes you regret it.
Why
Sometimes
has this combat gone 10 rounds and he still has 100 HP? What have I done?
He's bloodied in his, he had 100 health? No, now he's bloody. Don't worry about it. Let's just I want to go to the bathroom, please.
Yeah.
Let me go.
And that's even a harder thing to change with mechanics.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
Like it's tough. Like Arcteno mentioned this, but it's so true with magic items. When you give someone an effect, it like sometimes you have to hot fix it then and there.
Oh yeah, actually it doesn't work like that. Sorry.
I think the first big issue that I ran into where I had to hot fix it was like the uses. I had it 3 uses per long rest, and I was like, dog, you get this once per dawn. Like, there's no way I'm letting you do this 3 times a day, or like 3 times a longer rest. It's so broken.
Fair enough, yeah.
So yeah, fair word of warning to DMs as well. When you start homebrewing your own classes, your own items, your own spells, be wary and try to reference material, because it's so easy for you to make something super unbalanced.
And
exactly.
Realize that this one item, when used by the specific subclass of a cleric, it becomes super busted.
Yeah.
Or this thing, it stacks with this other thing that stacks with this other thing, and now you have 3 different sources of resistance. Your damages have to like an eighth of what you take. And it comes with unexpected results, really, lots of times.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, definitely, it's wild.
So I think that'll be our last topic. Hopefully that answered the question of the person who submitted that, and hopefully they're watching. But otherwise, regardless, really good question.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Really interesting to chat about. So we're just over an hour, so I think we'll wrap it up. Yeah, this one kind of flew by.
Time goes fast when you're having fun.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you all for joining us for session 2. Again, just a quick reminder, for those of you who aren't already in the Discord, make sure you hop in the Discord. I'll provide a Vanity link. Yeah. If you can PM me the Vanity link real quick, I'll put it in the Twitch chat, so that everyone can hop in and join us. That would be fantastic. But yeah, thanks again for joining us. Please submit your questions again on the Discord. We will be putting out the form so you guys can submit.
Actually, I have no idea how to pull it from my phone.
Topic suggestions.
Use my laptop after.
No worries. I think I can grab server settings and possibly invite.
You have to have perims for that.
Oh, cringe. How
But
could
yeah,
you?
I'll be able to. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll be able
so
to do that.
we'll pop it. We'll pop it in the chat
Yeah.
right when we close out during the outro.
Stick
So
in
keep
there
an eye out for that.
like
But
just
yeah,
a bit.
hop in if you're not in the Discord already. Give us suggestions for topics. Again, the only reason we covered modular versus homebrew was because people asked. So
Yes.
if you guys have a specific topic, please let us know. We'll try and cover it. So
We're
yeah,
looking forward to hearing anything that anything you want to say, even just like tips and like stuff that y'all find may improve the stream. Is also, we take that feedback very
Oh, yeah.
seriously, like lighting, key thing,
like not being in the
yeah.
grim dark.
or not looking straight into the camera during the whole podcast, and like just staring with dead eyes into it.
Oh,
I did that a bunch last one. I think I did it a bit this time. It's a force of habit, I guess. But yeah.
yeah. All right. Our Arcteno actually got us in the chat. So yeah,
Awesome.
CU dash DND
Thanks.
is what it was.
I think that's I'm pretty sure that's Michael.
Yeah, so discord.gg
Shout out
slash
to Michael,
CU-DND. Join us, get in the
Yeah.
conversation. But with that, I think we're going to tune out.
Yeah, no, pleasure talking to y'all. Yeah. See y'all next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Awesome.